Matt Kopp, welcome to Acquiring Minds.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Matt, you bought your first business the year before COVID hit, so 2019, and haven't really let up. Yours is a very entrepreneurial journey into buying businesses. Let's begin. What led you to search for a business to acquire in the first place?
I think I'd always sort of had entrepreneurial sort of spirit through my sort of childhood. Always worked, sort of odd jobs from sort of 13, 14 years old, and always had been around business owners. My uncle had his own sort of metal fabrication company, so I always used to work there as a kid and just sort of got to really understand what small business was early on. Going through sort of, university and then, getting my first job in finance, it was always sort of good to sort of see, I was like resonated with the business owners who we were doing deals for. That seemed to be something that I sort of eventually aspired to be. And then did my MBA and learned about search via my MBA. And I sort of said that was something that would be interesting to do. Didn't think it was sort of real. The Australian market didn't really have that sort of environment that existed back when I sort of did my MBA in 2015. So I joined a consulting firm and then eventually worked for what's sort of a comparable to Walmart in the Australian market. Ran a P&L, so effectively, had ran all the trucks and the warehouses for a Walmart equivalent called Coles in Australia. And that was a really sort of, proper, sort of top 20 company on this Australian stock market. So, big environment, big corporate environment. It just wasn't for me. I knew that I wasn't fit for corporate really, really early on. I guess I was, I was always thinking smarter and harder than most people, but I think in a corporate world, that doesn't necessarily mean it gets you up to the sort of, the ladder. You need to sort of be a bit more political, sit on your hands a little bit more and just listen rather than just do. And I think that's what sort of led me to sort of say, hey, maybe I should really try this ETA path. So in 2018, I tried to raise what's like a traditional search fund in the Australian market that hadn't been done before. And
you had heard about your exposure really is the books coming out of the States and what you're reading about the model from the States.
Yeah, 100%. So I took a thinking like an entrepreneur class in my MBA. I went to school, did my MBA called at Melbourne Business School, which is one of the leading MBA programs in the Australian market. And we had a subject called thinking like an entrepreneur, and search funds or ETA was one week effective that we went through. So, and that's where I got introduced to the Harvard Business, sort of how to buy a small business. That became my Bible, much like most of your other sort of talkers on your show. And I just sort of took it. I'm like, wow, this is great. And that's where I sort of got through to the Stanford Primer and then just started doing Google desktop research on what is this search fund thing. I got to the point where, as I said, going back in 2018, I'm like, okay, I want to really do this. I reached out to the Relay, events at like Pacific Lake. I spoke to Jan Simon at Vonzio before he had Vonzio at the time and talked to him about how I really want to sort of, create Australia's first, first search fund. I think the premise was that they were interested in the Australian market at the time, but they wanted to have Australian investors who were also understanding of the model that they could effectively rely on to be like the backstop and cornerstone in the Australian market. Mm-hmm. My networks at the time, everyone was we'll back you, but give me a deal first. So this whole premise of search capital just didn't really exist in the market. So rather than sort of me trying to sort of keep knocking on doors and trying to get this sort of cornerstone Australian investor that the sort of institutional American guys asked me to do, I sort of said, I'll just start searching anyway. And that's sort of, so that sort of 8-month process, I quit my job.
And Matt, how were you envisioning acquiring the business once you found it? Going to these Australian investors who said, bring me a deal and I'll consider investing. So doing it Correct. That way?
Yeah, just going through sort of in a standard sort of, single, find a deal and, make it work effectively. So I quit my job. I had sort of enough money to sort of back myself in and sort of gave myself like 12-month burn rate to sort of go and try and find something. That's sort of how we, came across the business I came across. It was a bit Great. Of an interesting search process, the way
I want to hear about that in just a sec. So this is all 2018, really. 2018 into 19. And so at that point in the Australian market, I've had a couple Australians on. There was really, you were out there by yourself, no one really to talk to about this, right? And it sounds like even at that time, there had been no traditional search fund that you were aware of ever in the country.
There was a couple of people who were in a similar situation to me. Like we met a couple of Australians, I met a couple of Australians on Search Funder. So I signed up to Search Funder, and sort of, at that stage, Search Funder was like everyone was in the States, and then you might like find three marks in the Australian market, right? Like that was it.
Yeah.
And so, we sort of started to get together and have some conversations with people about, how we're going to do this, what we're going to do. I think everyone has sort of come across ETA through the similar types of things via an MBA program. I think one person was in INSEAD, so he was aware of it because they had a fairly large ETA sort of, program there. So, very, very lonely, we'll call it. And really not much support going through the process.
Well, okay, so great. Let's now hear about the search, because also just business buying in general is less mature, let's call it, than a U.S. market, for example. And so there is no biz buy sell to turn to, or otherwise, or even the brokers. Flesh that out for us. What's it look like to search?
Yeah, so we had a similar sort of, not at the same level of biz buy sell, but there were some online, online platforms that did have commercial business for sales. Most of those were like fish and chip shops or hospitality sort of ventures. You wouldn't really find good businesses for sale. There is definitely a business broker market in the Australian market, but it was very, very hard to cut through to those guys. Especially like I was a 27-year-old, didn't really have any business experience. To try and sort of penetrate that wall that exists with the business brokers is really, really hard. I found also with the business broker deals that I actually got to have a look at, it was great learning to sort of start to have a look at different types of P&Ls and understand different types of industries, because I was agnostic. I was like, just give me a business, I'll make it work. You start to sort of see that, like, the IMs and the SIMs that come through, like what are these things? Like these are, nothing that I sort of initially, when I was in corporate advisory, we had like at least really, really good, good pitch decks that were sort of going out. These things look like, no offense to the Australian business brokers who probably were listening, but 12-year-olds will probably put them together. And so for me, it was like, well, that didn't really appeal to me, I think. So I think, again, because I'd been sort of reading about the way search funds had worked in the States, everyone had really been proprietary search is the only way to really go and try and find a good deal. So that's all I sort of assumed that I needed to do. So I sort of put the business brokers aside from day one and said, I'm just going to do what all the other searchers before me who have gone and got all these great returns, just to try and apply it to the Australian market. So creating databases, the yellow pages was a really good sort of thing. I found an online yellow page scraper where I effectively just got all the leads from yellow pages and just started like picking up the phone and trying to find emails for these people and just started sending them emails. That was just like a really sort of, bazooka approach, just trying to find anything that I absolutely could. That was the first sort of 3 months. Then I found a database that effectively had all the Australian business owners' names and their sort of estimated revenues and employee size. I'm like, hey, this is starting to get somewhere. And then just started doing a proper sort of cold email, cold outreach to certain types of industries. I sort of landed on healthcare and education as industries that I sort of wanted to play in. And that was really more around buying my first business in the Australian market, no one to support. I've got to try and sell this to these investors who don't really, buy into this sort of small space normally anyway. At least if I have like a thematic around a safe, resilient sort of proof, industry, at least I might be able to get some sort of, some help from them or some capital. And sort of taking back from like the sort of, how to buy a business, from Rick and Royce, the way they sort of say, look at a P&L and go down to the bottom of the P&L, because these sort of, areas are generally where you'll find that no one's looking to sort of cut costs. So therefore they're probably sticky revenue, reoccurring in nature. And I don't know what happened. I was just scouring the internet trying to find, healthcare profit and loss statements, private hospitals, looking at schools. And I came across a couple of school P&Ls. I was like, okay, let's have a look at this. Just where do schools spend their money? And that's where I sort of came down, right down the bottom of the line, like this sort of lab resources and, lab supply and school science supply. And, I sort of started doing some more research on it, and they have like, budgets in the Australian market, schools will spend anywhere between $20,000 and $50,000 a year on their science resources, glass, microscopes, beakers, all those types of things. I'm like, this seems like a fairly cool niche type of industry to sort of play in.
Yeah.
And then just sort of like just Googling like school supplies online, trying to find out how many existed. And I found that there wasn't really many. It was a really, really shallow market, so not fragmented as sort of people sort of say that you need to be. Go and buy a fragmented space. So there's like 30 companies that I found in the Australian market. This is like that had a digital presence, I guess. I ended up finding out there's many more that just didn't have a digital presence. And yes, eventually contacted one of the vendors that called Southern Biological. So And there was like we contacted the owner a few times on an email.
Hey, Matt, let me stop you before we hear about Southern Biological. In general, the proprietary outreach, were you getting responses?
Yes, 100% we were. Like it was really, really interesting. I think, this is 2018. This is before anyone was probably really trying to go down that process of contacting small businesses. I had no really idea how big these businesses were, but I would imagine someone, with a business that's making 3 to 5 million of revenue, around, so sub $1 million of EBITDA or a little bit higher, they're probably not getting people emailing them that often saying, hey, I want to buy your business. And I sort of took the approach when I did my outreach, and still do it today, and it works, is that I didn't really come across as a private equity person. I literally, like, in the subject line was, let me buy your business. My name's Matt. I want to buy your business. I think it's great. Contact me if you're interested. What I used to do, though, is I used to track email open rates. It was a bit of a sort of a sneaky sort of way of doing things, but I would sort of be sending these emails out, and I'd get an alert if someone had opened the email. And then if someone, for some reason, I've been noticing this sort of pattern recognition, so that people will keep opening up the same email 4 or 5 or 6 times, even though it says 5 or 6 things. And as soon as someone had kept doing that, I'd be like, I'm going to pick up the phone and call these people. And so then I'd call these people straight away and say, hey, how are you? You get to the gatekeeper, and normally the gatekeeper would sort of do a good job. But when people have just recently opened this email, you'd say, hi, I'm Matt from, wherever I was at the time. I'd like to speak to this person's name. You get through and they're like, I'm just reading this email now. You're like, it's meant to be fate then, isn't it? Right? Like, it was just because these old people generally, they don't realize, 60-year-old person doesn't, most of them anyway, don't realize that, you're tracking their open rates on their email.
Right.
And so that was a really, really good way of actually getting cut through, just tracking email opens. And then if you can, call them as soon as an opens occurred, because you might be front of mind then, and you actually can at least then have a conversation. Because a lot of the time when you're speaking to these people, they think that it's a scam most of the time. Right? So you need to try and cut through that really quickly. And I was always quite personal when I could have a conversation with these people, and I really sort of got through, and, it's just turning the page one page faster than them. Like, they ask questions like, why do you want to buy my business? At times, I didn't even know what business I was speaking to. I was like, I've got to research this business, before I even, just to sound that I had some type of credibility. But yeah, I ended up speaking to probably, let's say, 40 business owners over that sort of period of time that was actually went past sort of the initial stages where there was some level of interest. And then, landed on Southern.
And do you think that today, 7 years later, you'd have the same luck outreaching cold to business owners? Or do you think that it's congested as it is here?
No, definitely not congested. Yeah. So I still use the same approach now, doing what I'm doing, always hunting for new deals. And it's a really proven, tried method. The lack of competition in the Australian market makes it it's a gold mine still, right? And we'll talk about that around multiples and how that works at the moment. But
Anything else to say about, well, we will return kind of throughout the conversation to the Australian market, but anything from this chapter of being a searcher just out there doing proprietary search completely on your own to say about it, or are we good?
It's a tough journey. I think everyone sort of, it's a lonely journey. I think that's the sort of the common thematic that keeps coming up with a lot of searchers. Especially in a market where there isn't many, you're trying to explain to people what you're doing. Like, all my friends thought I was crazy, dropping a fairly sort of high paid job to go and search for a business, without really any experience. So I think, you're constantly not just reminding yourself that you've got a really good, good path ahead of you, but reminding everyone around you. Like, I just had my second kid at that stage. So I had like a 2-year-old who was born, and then like my daughter was born in 2018 when I started searching. So I was dealing with a couple of different fronts as well when we're going through that process. But you just got to have belief in yourself that that there's a goal in mind that you need to try to achieve, and if you push through, I think it's a really good thing, right? Like, grit and resilience is really, really important, a part of the small business ETA journey. If you don't have that, you're going to fail. And I think a part of the search process really sort of self-selects out the people who can and cannot do it. And so I think it's a good way of sort of going through that process.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well put. Okay, Matt, tell us about Southern Biological.
Southern Biological was a science biological supplier of specimens. Think when you go to school and you do a frog or a rat dissection, these were the guys who supplied the Australian market with that, amongst thousands of other products as well. They'd been around in the market for 45 years, started as a catalog business, effectively printed out some catalogs and just started sending it out to schools. I bought it off a second owner. So the original owner 45 years ago created it. He was like an ex-science teacher. Said, I'm going to start producing products and making products for schools. I bought it from a chemical engineer who bought it when he was in his sort of 50s as a sort of, he got redundant from his job and then said, what am I going to do? And he went and bought this business. So I bought it off him. So very much a scientist sort of led management for the 45 years before I came into it. And it was a good little solid business, right? So it'd been doing around about 2.2 million revenue for the last sort of 5 years before I bought it. Quite steady, like wasn't really ups and downs. It was just maybe like 2-3% every single year. Had about 12 staff members working in the business, effectively just working in customer service and warehousing and lab manufacturing and some of the stuff they make. Making EBIT of around 350 to 375, and that's sort of, call it SDE. We'll call it, that's the sort of terminology. We eventually
you had said it's organic material, the organic science supplies, so not the beakers and the test tubes.
Yeah,
the specimens and the pond water, I think, was another example you gave me in the pre-call.
Yeah, so they definitely still sold the beakers and the test tubes, but that was like maybe 5% if that. Labware, what we call labware, is about 5% of revenue. They had all these ponds at the front of their sort of factory and warehouse that I was quite curious about when I sort of was doing my due diligence process. And those ponds themselves were just full of different microscopic specimens that they would have effectively a lab technician who would go out each week and just go ponding, to try and find these different types of worms or, little bugs or little water fleas or whatever it was. And they would then just sort of keep popping that up every single week.
How funny.
So that's school. So schools would, use, you can get like a microscope slide that you sort of have a picture of, some type of specimen. We would then provide the living specimen of that slide. So people could actually, kids could see what the live actual specimen is doing. Plus, we selling vials of bacteria and antibiotics, and we had cockroaches, and we had like a rat farm up the top that was sort of our warehouse, where there was like getting pregnant rats to then sell for schools so that they could sort of do pregnant studies. It was a very, very strange, unique type of business. I think what attracted it to me was that it was the only one in the Australian market that was selling it, because it was like, it's who wants to do that type of stuff, right? It's super ugly, super niche, where all the other competitors were just box in, box out businesses where they would probably bring something in from China, pack it down, and then send it back out to schools. Where we were actually a bit more value add, where we actually created products, added products, and whether they're living or not living.
And given that it was kind of a monopoly, did you penetrate every school system? I mean, did you what was the growth possibility here?
Yeah, so I think there was two things. We were in one, so they were based in one state, and so they had to think about states of America. We're like a California of the whole of the states. They obviously built up a really, really big brand awareness in that sort of in state of Victoria where I live, and so, but they had other schools across the rest of the nation that were still ordering some things from them, albeit it wasn't as high a basket size as what that sort of the home state was. So I definitely saw that at a basket size level based on a school, I saw that there was an opportunity to try and scale that up a little bit. So if the average basket size for a Victorian school was $1,000 a year, I thought maybe I could, and every other state was $300 a year. I knew that there was definitely an upsell that I could potentially do there. Didn't know how that was going to happen at the time, but I just knew that it was going to happen. I think the thing that was most attractive to the business is that even though there was no contracted revenue, the schools had kept coming back every year, every month. It was almost like on repeat. The other thing I liked about the school market is that you knew what they were buying every single term. So to be able to predict demand was really, really easy, because it wasn't so scattered, because we have a curriculum, and the Australian curriculum is fairly consistent across. So I knew that in January I'm going to need X amount of this product, and then in February I'm going to need X amount of this, rather than having to sort of guess my demand planning. It was almost like fixed demand planning on a monthly level, and I knew that was going to be really, really helpful from a supply chain and purchasing sort of pattern.
Yeah.
And so, that's why it became quite attractive.
It sounds attractive, other than maybe the nature of some of what you're selling, but in 350 SDE here would be considered small. Was it also small there? Is that kind of as small as we might consider it here?
It's sort of small as small, right? Yeah. So I think the number is the number. I think I went into the process of, thinking I wanted that sort of $1 million EBITDA number that I wanted to try and achieve. But I also sort of was of the mindset of, I just want to get in as quick as possible as well. I saw an opportunity to sort of scale and get to $1 million quite quickly. So I was like, for me, it was just, let's just get in rather than sort of wait. Self-funded, you don't really have the time sometimes just to sort of just wait for that perfect deal.
Great. What can you tell us about the structure of the acquisition?
So structure-wise, we ended up buying the business for just a bit under 3 times, including working capital. We put a 15% seller note on the owner over a 3-year period. I ended up buying back that seller note just because I could get better debt terms once I was actually in the business. So there was effectively bank debt. So it was a bank debt financed about 40% of it. There was 15% that was financed from the seller note, and then the rest was equity injection.
And the equity injection, just you out of your pocket?
No, I had 2 investors who were able to sort of who supported me along the way.
Okay. And can you talk about the structure of that?
Yeah, so we tried to sort of do it like a traditional search fund model. Again, I didn't really have any sort of idea about how to structure these things. I think, if I sort of think back, if I could go back in time now, I would have asked for a little bit more. But effectively, we sort of had that same sort of, third sort of expectation of how I set up with the investors, where it would be sort of a little bit now, a little bit over time, and a little bit on performance. I eventually ended up working myself through the journey, and we'll talk about the different types of acquisitions I made and how I was able to beef that up, but effectively had the right to earn up to 35% of the equity at the time. That's sort of how we structured.
And how much of your own equity did you have to put in?
None. No, so I didn't put anything in.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's pure sweat equity.
So you said for a little under 3x, which included working capital, so about $1 million.
It was at 1 point, just under 1.2. Yeah.
1.2 million. Okay. And the multiple, now this is a pretty small business, but very desirable characteristics seemingly. But the multiple still seems lower than you'd probably find on a similar business here. Is there anything to say there? Am I reading too much into it? Is that perhaps the nature of the Australian market, where there aren't 5 searchers who want to buy this business?
I probably paid too much for it, to be perfectly honest with you, on a multiple level. Yeah. So I think anything that's probably doing sub 500,000 of earnings, you'd probably be 2 to 3 times is probably where you're looking for. And then, the Australian market, realistically, you're not paying over 5 times for anything less than 2 million of EBITDA. If you're buying something that's over more than 5, it might be in the software space, but I think that's starting to get a lot more competition in. But in general, 5 times is the max you'll pay. It probably averages out around 4 times in the sub 2 million space. So sub $1 million, I'm paying 3 times. With working capital, I think that was in my deal I worked at. They had a balance sheet anomaly on their inventory, which sort of gave me a free kick. So it actually probably went back down to maybe sort of in that sort of 2.5 sort of space when I worked out. There's an extra 400,000 of inventory that wasn't on the balance sheet. The owners didn't realize it was on the balance sheet. But from a deal size perspective and a multiple entry perspective, it's between 2 and 5 really. But that hurts as well, because getting out also means it's probably around that same size unless you get scale.
Exactly. Okay. And we'll probably return to that. The subject of multiples is going to come back up later. And then the debt. So how difficult or not is it to get bank debt to buy a business in Australia?
Extremely difficult. So the bank debt that I got was actually supported by a mortgage to sort of get into the deal. So most bank, especially when you're buying businesses that low, they will want full recourse secured by property to actually borrow the money. And so, yeah, there was effectively property-backed debt to get into the acquisition phase, which was then refinanced into cash flow, non-recourse a year in. But yeah, so it's really tricky, right? Like once you have a business, it's much easier to get debt because you have an asset that you can secure it against. But when you don't have an asset to secure it against, the banks will always generally say, do you have a property to mortgage effectively against?
And if you hadn't had a property, do you think you would have gotten the loan then?
There were other options that I was looking at because I didn't really want to put the personal guarantee down and put the sort of, put the house on the line. But you'd be paying, 15, 20%, like almost like loan shark type territory when you're really having to sort of try and get that down, like 3-year sort of pay down periods over 20%. Like the options were there, but obviously it's probably an option I didn't really want to take.
Yeah. Okay. And also the leverage you got was just 40% of the acquisition price, as opposed to what we might find here, 80, 90% sometimes with an SBA loan. Not going to happen in Australia?
Doesn't happen. We don't have SBA here. You're never going to get 80, 90%. Oh, so I shouldn't say never because one of my deals I did, but very, very highly unlikely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll probably hear about that. So do you think what you said there about it's difficult to get a loan when you are without a business trying to buy a business, but once you're in the business and you can borrow against the business, which is what you did, is that a tip that you would offer to other searchers in Australia to kind of try to do what you can to get in the business because you can probably refinance into some, a loan that's much more favorable to you in the first year?
Definitely. I think what a lot of the bankers are doing when they're trying to sort of assess whether you've got the right skill set to run a business is, do you have the skill set to run a business? So that's really like they're investing in you more so than investing in the asset most of the time. So even if you come from, a McKinsey, Bain, BCG background and you want to go buy a manufacturing company, they're going to say, do you have any manufacturing experience, consulting experience, even though they don't generally look it through. They look through the title and the brand and go, actually, do you have tangible experience? So I found that out I didn't really know that was going to be the case. I sort of found it out the hard way or the easy way, however you like to sort of say it. But yeah, definitely. I think once you have, a year in running a business and a small business and you have got cash flow coming through and you've got some, balance sheet that you can sort of, put on the line, a bank would be much more easy to sort of pass through to say, okay, business already exists. Is it working capital loan? Are they looking for acquisition finance? What are they actually looking for debt for? Is it helping grow the business? That's their bread and butter, right? But buying a brand new business by someone like a rookie who's got no experience in that industry, that's just like putting all the red flags up for them because there's so much risk inherently in small business, let alone someone who's got no experience running it. Okay, great.
So you get into business. Tell us about the transition in your ownership of Southern Biological.
Yeah, so the transition was what I effectively did was sign we had that seller note for 3 years, so that was always tying the existing owner to the business. So I had a call to him whenever I sort of needed to. Initially, I set up a sort of an option, a transition agreement effectively that allowed me to sort of have the owner working with me for 3 to 6 months, and then for an additional 6 months where I could call upon them. I didn't really sort of execute that 12 months. Probably in the first 2 months, I said, thank you, I don't need you anymore. They became probably more dead weight for me than anything. I think the business I inherited was fairly simple, right? Like we had schools who were contacting us. We were just giving them product. There was probably some gaps that I had around the technical aspects of the product that I was selling. And that's where I focused a lot of my effort and attention on the existing owner. The existing owner was not a businessman, he was a scientist. So he probably went overboard on the science stuff where the customers were really just happy just to take a product half the time.
Yeah.
And so I think I sort of realized that really quickly and sort of like just downloaded everything I actually needed from him from a science and technicality space, because I've got no science background, no education background, I'm just a commerce guy and a finance guy. And so for me, it was like, I can probably run the business better than him. I just don't know the content as much. And so, so that transition period was probably 2 months, initially 5 days a week, went down to 4 days quite quickly. Eventually I was trying to be nice and kept him around for 2 days a week. And then eventually we just sort of had conversations. Hey, listen, I've got you for 12 months. on a contract that I can call you. You're done. Thank you very much for all for your assistance. I'll make sure that and he still used to like pop in occasionally just to see how things were going. But that was probably more of a distraction than a help, to be perfectly honest with you. I think, and that's probably because I changed the business quite rapidly, and I through my due diligence process, I already knew what my 30, 60, 90-day plan was going to look like. And having the existing owner there makes it harder to enact that change. When you sort of feel, you almost like feel sorry for sort of laying out the low hanging fruit that's right in front of him, and all of a sudden you're just like taking it all up. And there was one moment I think that we created a little change, and he just couldn't believe that change created so much value straight away. It was almost like it was lying in the face for him, but he was just for 20 years he hadn't done anything with it. So,
and do you remember what that particular change was, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so they had a website but didn't have a payment gateway on the website. So what would happen is people would come through and effectively create draft orders on this website, and then they would then take a phone call from the customer saying, here's my cart, can I now pay for it? Which, and most of the time that was either a purchase order from the schools or, very rarely credit card, because they didn't really have a credit. Like, there was a bit clunky system that they had to sort of take credit card payments. They could only take credit card payments from like one type of credit card, and that was it, because it was so just the systems they had were sort of quite poor. So I just effectively got like a payment gateway online, and cash flow went up straight away because people were paying by credit card straight away. We were getting orders that we weren't getting probably before because people didn't want to have to pick up the phone and they were going somewhere else for something else. It was just, a really, really quick win.
It's funny, having the seller around while you're under your new ownership is often talked about as very delicate, often more trouble than it's worth. For a variety of reasons, classic among them being it's kind of awkward for the employees. They're worried about split loyalties. They don't know who to report to. Too many cooks in the kitchen, sort of thing. But I've never heard this. I don't think I've ever heard this reason, that it beats up on the morale of the seller to see you go in there and have early successes. They're kicking themselves. Why didn't I do that?
Yep.
Sort of thing. Yeah. Anyway, what other changes did you make, Matt? Because you said you moved quickly.
Yeah, so first 2 months was just sit and learn and bite my tongue, really, while I was like wanting to see everything. I got into a habit of asking questions and then realizing the questions I was asking weren't really questions, almost like backhanded stabs to the owners with regards to why they haven't been doing things. So I sort of learnt really quickly to just bite my time and knew that I wanted to sort of pull the trigger on things rapidly. That's why I sort of exited the owners. I told you about the payment gateway stuff. We had, 5 people working in customer service who predominantly his job was just to answer phones and take these payment orders. So initially I sort of had this sort of, redundancy set in really, really quickly with staff. I also, like they were also using like an old archaic accounting system and software. And I sort of alluded to before where that they had an inventory error of when I bought the business. So all the stuff I was looking at from their accounting system was under-reporting inventory. So that was a really big thing for me to sort of start getting track on inventory. So I needed to implement some type of system to be able to do that. So we implemented NetSuite into this business, knowing that it was too big of system for the business at the size it was, but I knew that I was going to be able to scale by having at least data and live data whenever I really wanted. And so implemented a new system, had this redundancy in staff. The system that we implemented also made staff redundancy even more so. So we probably went from a team of 12 to 5 really, really quickly, I'd say, maybe 4 months.
Wow.
Just cut. It's really, really interesting, right? Like, I think there were some people in there who, different layers, but senior people, and call them managers, but senior people. And these are the people that the owner was like, you really need to rely on these senior people because they're the ones who are going to help you when I'm not here. I found the senior people were the worst people to actually have in a small business because they've been working status quo for 20 years or 15, 10 years with this one owner who hasn't been doing anything in their company. Someone like me comes in and all of a sudden I'm giving them a pay cut because they're having to work their full 40 hours a week. There's no longer them sitting around having coffee for an hour and then turning the lights on and then having a chit chat. Like, it's actually, no, we've got these strategies now. These are the people I've inherited. I need to get them to work.
Yeah.
And so they're gone from 50% efficiency to 100% efficiency, and they're not getting anything in return from that apart from me just sort of pushing in the more. It was a bit of a learning for me, I think, because, you know, I've come from a really sort of high intense work, 80 hours a week type sort of, you know, environment I wanted to apply that to small business. And then you've got these people who are there for 40 hours, but they're really only working for 20 of them. And the standard of that work, even in the 20 hours, is like probably worth 5 hours of someone who actually goes in. And so for me, I was like, well, hang on, I can do all of these people's job. You know, I know it's not scalable, but I was really trying to get the business from A to B, I think, for me to then scale. So I took on a lot of people's responsibility. It was great because I actually got to learn the business from the ground up. But getting rid of the dead weight, I think, was really, really important, I think, in the early days. You know, in hindsight, I'm probably maybe, you know, morale within the office was a bit chipped. But for me, it was like...
Say more about that, Matt, because I have to believe that was actually, there was a lot of risk in that, and that morale was more than chipped. I'm not sure exactly how that maps to what American word that maps, but it doesn't sound very serious, but it probably was pretty serious to morale.
Yeah, no, it definitely was. I think, you know, I went in with a very probably arrogant approach to sort of small business, where I thought that, you know, I've got this really great business. And for me, the business was the brand, the product, and its customers, right? It wasn't the people underneath. I was actually really surprised by the people that were able to create this business, and the maintain it. And I think that's where I sort of said, like, I went in, I'm like, wow, this business is so amazing because these people here are getting this recurring revenue every single day. And I almost got a bit arrogant of thinking that the people aren't really driving this success. It's just this monopoly business just being in the right place at the right time, having the right product with little competition allows it to sort of be so much greater. And so, you know, firing people who had been, you know, in the business, you know, making them redundant, being in the business for, you know, some of 15 years had been in that business. One lady had been working in the business for up to 30 years who was actually seen 2 owners, or me being the third owner. But there's just no value for that person to be there anymore. So there's some people who are really annoyed by that. But I had really frank conversations with these people to sort of say that, you know, I'm there to sort of grow the business, you know, secure their jobs even more so. And so I was very strategic with the people that I align myself with. And then the people who weren't happy, they eventually sort of, they left. In saying that though, even though there was unhappiness and morale was poor, you know, in the early stages when everyone, well, 50% of the staff got cut, no one left. There was some tears, there was some heated moments, there was some threatened to walk outs, but they all eventually did stay, which was, I still think, you know, they loved the company and they loved where the company was going to and the trajectory it was going. So I think,
and by they you mean the 5 that remained.
Correct.
So 7 were left, and the 5 that remained. And then, but so just so you're crystal clear, Matt, or I'm crystal clear. I hear you say that maybe you were a little bit arrogant, and so on. So were you wrong in how you? Because I'm also hearing you say, actually justify the way you approach this in a way that actually sounds pretty logical. That. Yeah. So which one was it? Would you go back and do it differently?
I would do it with a little bit more humility, I think. So would I still make the same decisions? Yes. I think it's more just the how. It's not the what, it's the how.
I see. So your style was maybe
correct. Yeah, definitely style. I think, you know, there may have been a better way to sort of let people go, and, you know, give them reasons for, you know, better reasons, I guess. I think, you know, in that sort of early stage, I'm just like bull at a gate trying to get, you know, scale and growth as much as possible. And you always sort of forget that there is a human element to it. I guess, you know, as a 27-year-old who really hadn't managed anyone before, especially like blue collar or sort of, you know, like we'll call it low end white collar staff before, the approach and style definitely probably needs to be more well suited. I didn't go into small business with some people go into there because they want the love of managing and they want to have, you know, they want to create a really good culture. I went into small business to have direct impact at bottom line, really. That was sort of where I sort of had a lot of focus on. So when you go in with that mindset, you almost forget that there's sometimes people there and they just become well, I'm paying that person 70,000 a year. That's going straight to the bottom line. I'm paying 50,000 to that person. That's going straight bottom line. It was a bit cutthroat. But it needed to be done. It was it's
bloated.
Yeah, a bloated P&L. Yeah.
And then the putting in NetSuite and some of the changes that you made. I mean, the reduction in staff is a big change, but I guess operational changes. Anything more to say there?
I think dashboards and data are the lifeblood of any growth story. I think we for the first time was able to actually see, live sales data, be able to do, like we uploaded all our historic sales. It was like clunky as we needed to really needed to spend a lot of time on cleansing the data from existing and archaic systems. But being able to sort of use that data and the dashboards that NetSuite were able to provide was really, really important for us to sort of scale and grow and focus on where we wanted to grow. And so I think being able to, the one problem with NetSuite and just putting any new system into place is that someone's got to use it. So again, even though I had gotten rid of most of these staff members, I still needed someone to be actioning, the orders and actioning using the system. One thing I always, and that's one thing I probably have learned is that, someone who's 55 years old who's never used a system before, don't expect them just to watch a YouTube video and tutorial and be a gun at using a software for the first time in 1 week. So there was a lot of time spent having to sort of hold people's hands through that process. I learned the thing in a couple of months, but I was still 6 months later, still giving people troubleshooting on how to use the system in the way that I wanted it to be used so that we could enter orders, do quotes, whatever the actual the process was.
While it might have been tumultuous, it doesn't sound like you had fetal position moments. And it doesn't sound like, well, what was the outcome, both on revenue and on EBIT?
Yeah, so year one, we went from 2.1 to 2.7 mil, and then grew EBIT from 350 to 650 in the first year.
So obviously fantastic performance.
So it was a fairly good win, yeah.
And that sales increase to up to 2.7 came from?
So I think there was a lot of missed baskets that we're not getting initially from the business because of the payment gateway issue. So I think we're just able to get some stuff that way. An updated website just allowed things to sort of be accessed a lot easier rather than having to go through 50 pages to get the product that they actually wanted. Like just putting best sellers on page one, just something as simple as that. So we went through I went through a website, website transformation like really, really early on. So just again, I don't really know, to be perfectly honest with you. Like it was, year one was about fixing the back end, making things easier for our customers. But when anything to do with product development or anything like that, didn't understand anything. I was still learning what the products were, to be perfectly honest with you. So I can't give you pinpoint stuff, but I would imagine that the website and payment gateway was probably just transferring orders. And the cost savings obviously came from staff. Majority of that was just the staff, and then obviously increase revenue margin.
Great, Matt. Well, you what happens then? You kind of take us along now, because I know COVID a lot starts happening quickly.
So that's 2019. 2020 Australia. 2020 COVID happens for everyone. So around about March 2020, and our Australian government took a pretty really significant approach to trying to stem that, where they locked us down. So everyone got locked down across this country for 30 days. It was a 40-day lockdown, I think, in my state. And that meant no work. Like we couldn't even go to work. It was like just everyone stay home. The world stops. And that's not different to anywhere else, in the world at that point in time. Everyone sort of was really trigger happy just to say stop at the start. I guess for us, we were really lucky from a timing perspective, because the start of our school year is January to March. So that's always a busier time for schools. So we had a really, really good first term, I guess, for sales, which meant that, we generated probably 40% of our initial cash in that first term, which meant that the business had cash flow. So it wasn't going to, sort of fall over. And so the 40 days happens. And then what happened eventually is we were able to slowly come back to work. But because I'd set these systems up, working from home became a possibility probably for the first time in this company ever. And I loved it. loved the fact that I had people working from home and not coming into the office. So these customer service people and lab people and stuff, like they would constantly come because they're using the system all the time. They constantly keep coming and barging in my office and asking me for things. And, everything was, sort of important to them and urgent at the time. But in my sort of important, urgent sort of philosophy was like, not important and not urgent. I'm trying to focus on scaling and growing this business rather than sort of dealing with, problems. And so I think working from home really helped me and helped them, because they would only come to me when they actually really it's a next step. I don't know how it works, but when you're working in an office, walking to someone's office is so much easier. Yeah. But if you put some type of invisible barrier there of like having to work remotely, they only really think when they want to speak to you or contact you.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so, it promotes, someone to sort of do their own thing and take their own, initiative rather than sort of ask someone all the time. It's like there was used to this thing where someone's asking you a question, like, let me Google that for you. You actually send them like a let me Google that for you link where you just go and type in your Google how to do it. That's almost how it came about. Like people asking inane questions that they could have just shown their own initiative to go and find the answer themselves. So that was really, really good. So COVID happened. We went to a standstill. 40 days came back and slowly started coming back on live. The rest of Australia opened, but Victoria then went into another lockdown halfway through, which means that I was the only one. Me and I could choose one other employee to come into the office and to the warehouse. Everyone was working remotely, and yeah, we just sort of kept pushing through. So Victorian sales was sort of our one state where I live. That was put under sort of some pressure, but the rest of the country was open. So we had a really specific, our governor at the time, he went really hard on locking down. So it was a 100-day lockdown that second time around, where we weren't able to leave a 10-kilometer radius effective unless you were like considered a specialized worker or something along those lines that had a permit to go to work. And because we were a school supplier nationally, we were passed as a approved worker. So I was effectively running the company with me and one warehouse person and my three offshores, for 3 people working at home, doing everything that we needed to do. And the great thing about schools is that they have to keep spending money. They've got a budget they need to spend each year. So even though we lost all this revenue in that sort of first lockdown and the second lockdowns, it all came still towards the end and then some. I attribute that 3 to 4 month period of now I can focus on the business. All of the sort of important non-urgent matters that I really, really wanted to focus on, were front of mind for me. I had no more distractions. I was actually now focusing on working on the business and growth and how I could actually grow this business organically. And so, introducing brand new products, understanding the gaps, trying to increase that basket size, not only in my home state, but increase the basket size, across the states. That was all those initiatives and strategies were all fostered then. In addition, I guess, I think, we started thinking about inorganic strategies as well. I think I always sort of knew that I was going to get my growth from buying other businesses. And this was a time when there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and there were businesses that, in my state, weren't working because they were in lockdown. And, it was buy these businesses at today's discounted prices, with a known recovery coming in mind. So that's why I sort of said, let's just go and do something along those lines. As a part of, sorry, I'm going back and forth, but as a part of my sort of strategy about trying to deliver value, I knew that I had a lacking of science knowledge, but I knew that I wanted to be creating products where I probably need some science backing. So I was trying to find how I could sort of hire science people, people who understood science education, science teachers, scientists, didn't know who it was. And I sort of came across this business that I'd been looking at for about 6 months. It was it's called Hands on Science, which is effectively they had a bunch of science teachers who went to schools and taught them science workshops, because in our school system, you don't have science teachers. You've just got like a generalist teacher, and normally generalists sort of in like elementary school, like K to 6 type sort of stuff. They're generalists. They're not science people. And so what this business has been doing for 30 years has been going to these schools and teaching the science part of the curriculum, where the generalists really couldn't do it because they didn't have the knowledge.
At the elementary school level, for younger kids.
For younger kids. And so in that, I was like, this seems like a really good opportunity of being able to grab a business that wasn't doing anything at the time, but it had been doing really well for 30 years, but then grab a whole bunch of team who was able to fill the gap that I had with science content, science knowledge. And I sort of saw it as a really good sort of, good synergy, I thought.
Yeah.
And so I approached that business in the middle of COVID. They were like on their knees, they just sort of, two old women had run the business for 30 years. They were both in their 60s, and they were like, second round COVID lockdown killed them. They didn't want to go ahead with it anymore. But they had the staff that they were trying to protect and trying to hold. So I sort of made like a really lowball offer. The business was doing about 650,000 of revenue, so not much money. They were barely making a profit. So I paid about $100,000 for that business in that sort of end of that 2020 period. And again, went through a process of removing the fat that they had there. Within a year's time, that business sort of didn't hit the 650 number, hit about 500,000 in revenue, but we made about $150,000 of profit in that first year. So I paid my money back, but more importantly, I got access to about 30 science teachers. They were all like on a casual sort of basis, but 30 teachers that I could then use to beef up my content strategy that I wanted to do with my Southern Biological business, which was really, really important. So there's a really sort of good sort of synergy that I was able to sort of use from those teachers. And that really boosted, again, Southern's education offering, where we became we effectively started published we were in textbooks. We became like the partnership model for textbooks for all science, biological, practical, and lab assessments that actually occur. I sort of went through to the publishers and said, hey, I've got all these science teachers. We've got all these products that people want. They keep asking us how to use them. Why can't we now be in the books? So we started getting published. So it sort of started connecting together a little bit.
And so the synergies thesis worked.
No, definitely. Yeah. I wasn't able to learn about science and biology again, right? I stopped doing science in year 10, at school. So I didn't want to waste my time doing that. So trying to sometimes buying people is probably a really, really good strategy. I think that people don't focus on sometimes, I think buying a business, not just for its earnings, but buying for its people, I think, really helpful, helpful.
Sure. And, returning to the theme of the business being bloated, you had to let people go. Was it basically a repeat of the first story of Southern Biological, or did you do it differently with the wisdom of a couple years behind you?
So it was only about a year and a half behind me. I guess because it was in COVID times, I think it was a really easy strategy to do. I effectively had anyone who was on like a full-time non-teaching role will let go. I told the owners that from day dot that was going to happen, that there was no need for me to keep the back office. Like, they had 4 staff members who were working full time, doing customer service and quoting and doing, like managing the box, doing like warehouse and the logistics. So the stuff that I already had people for, so I didn't need them. Yeah. So I was really open and honest with them and just said, listen, I'm keeping your teachers, but I don't need anyone else. And so that was, no need to sort of be nice in that process, because it was pretty much, that's what I'm buying, your casual teachers. You're not making any money right now. I thought that schools were going to come back. When we're in the middle of lockdown too, everyone thought the world was over. We're going to be locked down forever. There's such short-sightedness. I think for me, it was like, I knew it was going to pass. And I knew that schools were going to need more education, even more so after so many kids being out of school for so long. So I knew there was going to be a really good bump really quickly.
Great. And so where does, after buying that business and establishing the complementary, the synergies between the two, where's the next milestone in the story?
Yeah, so I think 2 months after I bought that hands-on science business, I sort of got an appetite for buying businesses. I'm like, okay, this is really easy. Maybe I should go start hunting. I think what's that sort of Warren Buffett, when everyone's fearful, be greedy. When everyone's greedy, be fearful. For me, it was like everyone was afraid at the time. No one really sort of could see the forest for the trees at that time. So I was like, let's just go and find out who else would be willing to sell me their education business. So I emailed about 100 different types of email service providers, in the Victorian market I could find, and said, hey, I want to buy your business. I came across 2 music school providers that effectively they managed the music tuition. So again, in the elementary sort of school space, where if you want your kid to learn guitar or piano or something like that, the school would outsource that to a company who would then provide music teachers, and they would manage all of the music lessons, scheduling, deal with the parents. It was almost like a B2B to C relationship. You'd have a contract with the school,
but you deal with the parents, with the ultimate end user as a kid. And again, these businesses, together they were making, one was doing about 800,000 of revenue, the other was doing about 700,000 of revenue, about $150,000. One was doing about 100,000 on the other line, and I was able to do a really good sort of deal with those two, where I bought them, but because we didn't know when COVID was coming back, I was able to sort of tie them to a COVID number instead of said, this is what your business was doing. I'll buy it off you at that price, but it needs to hit that price. And so it's almost like putting some risk on them as well to say that they think COVID is going to sort of bounce back. And they were a bit ignorant to the fact that they had been spending, again, businesses have been around for over 20 or 30 years, owners who are not really focusing on their business too much through the process. It was just keeps printing cash. Why not? No, I don't really need to do anything. But I guess for me, I didn't want to really I had a team of me and 4 other people, right? So there's 5 of us, put too much stress on myself with that. So I sort of tied them to that deal under like an earn-out process, which meant that they were working in the business for me in that business while I could just still focus on all the other things. So they sort of stayed for 6 months each. When COVID sort of came back, they got a little bit of their money on their earn-out side, but effectively bought those things for less than 2 times earnings on both sides, and then merged them together, and then ripped out another, we'll call it 1 time of synergy by pulling them 2 together. And so again, was able to sort of buy another 500,000 of EBIT for less than 2 times through that process as well, eventually. And then bought another business as well. There's a circus training school business that went into schools and taught kids how to do juggling and put on school concerts at the end of the, at the end of a term. Like this, and in the end, I eventually had, at the end of 2021, I would have had, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, so 5 businesses now at that stage. Still like the original, the 5 from Southern, I had maybe 3 more now full-timers who were working across the other businesses, and about 100 casual staff members, all sort of sitting there ready to hit 2022 with a bang. And that's sort of what happened.
Matt, let's step back a little bit and just kind of reflect now. So you've, in 3 years' time, you've become this very entrepreneurial business buyer. You're assembling this kind of portfolio of elementary school education services. Are you, and I haven't actually heard, I guess first question would be, I haven't heard any examples of hardship. And in fact, you even said, this is buying businesses is easy. Let me go out and buy some more. Are you making it sound easier than it was, or was it in fact really not that hard?
I think that obviously buying a business, the first business was challenging. I think, the search process was challenging. COVID was that when COVID occurred, it was hard. That first 3 months I freaked out, because I still had debt to pay down. I was ignorant to know that schools would just bounce back and I'd have all that money come through. There was a lot of luck, obviously, as well, with regards to that first term before COVID happening. I had all that cash, so I was able to cash and no more, no responsibility to pay. I guess what happened was that the government did a lot of sort of wage subsidies over that COVID period, so I was able to get all my wage subsidy coming through, even though my revenue was actually growing. So I was generating cash. So there were times where I was like, I don't know what's going to happen, but then wage subsidy would come. And then I'm like, okay, great. There's an extra $400,000 of cash that I didn't think I was now going to get. I've now got, the COVID made, I was able to buy these businesses that probably wouldn't be able to be bought before for less than 2 times EBIT, all at once within a sort of 6 to 9 month period. Yes, it was challenging, but it was maybe just a lot of luck, or just being in the right place at the right time. I'm not sure, but there was still a lot of sweat, right? So,
well, a lot of sweat and a lot of, you did take risk and eyes wide open. You just said, when everyone's fearful, the Buffett quote, when everyone's fearful, be greedy, when everyone's greedy, be fearful. So there was a lot of uncertainty, as we all remember, around COVID, a lot of fear, and you were able to discipline yourself or have the fortitude or the vision to strike. And so you deserve credit for that, at least, intellectually.
Yeah, I guess so. I think, going back to sort of my original thesis of the industries that I wanted to play in, that sort of, if I look back in hindsight, that saved everything, right? Like if being in the education space or healthcare space, you generally know that things are going to be steady or they are going to bounce back. They definitely weren't, COVID proof. There was definitely some, I think if people think they want to buy, recession proof businesses, I don't think you ever think about pandemic proof. I think maybe that people will now think about it now because we've lived through it, but it definitely wasn't a pandemic proof business, but it was definitely, it bounced back faster than I think most other industries potentially would have. And so that definitely held me, that gave me a really, really good opportunity. But that was strategic, I guess, from the start as well.
Yeah. I think it was. I mean, you specifically chose education services, that and what was it, health, and so I know you only know the Australian market, but I feel like everything you're describing, the characteristics of the education market that you're describing, would be true in the States as well. So it's probably true in many places, many nations around the world. So I guess question being, I guess, is this a sector that you'd recommend others, not in Australia, not stepping on your toes, look at?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think education's always going to be there. They've got budgets always need to be spent. I think it's not a traditional search business. I think it's effectively it's a B2B wholesale retailer, right? That's effectively what my first business was. And then the service side of it was just such a cottage industry. I don't know if it's cottage in the States. So I think that could also turn people away because you're not going to get generally a huge business that's doing what my services do. But I think that gives you opportunity to create. Like I almost effectively started going, let's just create some type of education holdco. Like that's effectively what I was going for, right? I had all these different brands. Everything in the back office was all integrated, but, I had like 5 or 6 brands out, fronting customers. And so for me, it was just like, let's just keep buying these things. Like I can integrate the back office. They've all got, if you're buying old businesses that have been around for 20 or 30 years, they've got brand goodwill somewhere, right? So therefore, why not just leverage that? And generally schools, they just keep going back to the same customer they know all the time. Like I flirted with the idea of trying to come up with like some swanky name that sort of tried to integrate all of them together, but I knew that I wouldn't get any cut through because it's just so hard to attract school customers. I think when you can't just go and get a salesperson out there, because if the transaction size is only less than $1,000 or $2,000 per school, the likelihood of success of having a sales rep out there is really, really hard because the conversion rate doesn't really pay off half the time.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was just like I'd rather have $2,000 per school and have 50,000 schools out there to go and speak to, rather than sort of try and focus all my attention on big, large sort of some revenue price things coming through. So I've just lost my train of thought. Well,
the value of those relationships with the schools built over decades, where you already have the sale has been made. It's almost on autopilot. It's very diversified because it's basically a small amount of revenue per school over thousands of schools. That is really appealing. And from what little I know, I've had some exposure to selling into education systems. It is hard. It's kind of government-y. It's a budget, the budgets, establishing relationships. There's a lot of vendors actually trying to break in and compete for that budget. I'm a little over my pay grade here, but as I recall from experience some years ago, not the most pleasant place to try to build a business. If you already have those relationships, which of course is what this podcast is all about, buying something rather than building it from scratch, it's pretty defensible. It's pretty comfortable.
The customer moat in the school market is really, really strong. I think that's one thing I learned early days. Didn't know that initially, but it's so hard to market to the decision maker in a school, and because everyone's got their own thing. You've got the principals of a school generally don't spend any money; they're just a face. Then you've got the teachers. You might have a little budget. You might have a sports, the head of sports or head of science or who. It's really, really hard to find who they are. B, get through. You just can't rock up to a school and start selling something to a person because you don't know who it is. And so for me, it was like, I don't understand anyone who would want to start a business. But that's when I started understanding what I'd actually had in my sort of structure was, yes, it was great revenue generation and great cash flow generation, but my customer moat was so powerful that I knew that would be something worth selling eventually to anyone. Because someone who does want to come up, whether in the ed tech space or whether in a new product space, they're buying my customers, but then buying the revenue as well that's coming through that they can then cross-sell. Because that's what effectively we did as we went along. We started working out which customers are working in each one of our businesses, why aren't they working in each other? And then we could just start cross-selling each other's services, because eventually the person who does know you are the one person is the person who's paying you, because you've got the one bank account, you've got the one, business number. They know it's all one person. So eventually they go, oh, you're this one person who I keep paying everything into across 5 or 6 different services. That then gives you credibility. So then you have a conversation, start negotiating contracted type of works with schools. And that's effectively what we started doing. So rather than just being a piecemeal person who you come to us every 2 or 3 times, you're coming to us here, you're coming to us here, you're coming to us here. Why don't we create relationship where we actually work across all of your areas that we can actually service, and we can start giving you a discounted rate, but I can actually start increasing my basket size because you're not going to any other competitors, or you're not using my service because you don't know about it. A lot of the time it's about educating the educators, as I sort of always say, educating your customers. Customers generally don't know everything. Sometimes you need to tell them what they don't know. And then once they realize it's there, it's really easy to get that sale when someone else in the classroom beside them is using them.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we'll often hear in our world is this potential of cross-selling. So typically talking about a second or third acquisition and how it bolts on or complements the existing platform. And there's always a little bit of skepticism that some cross-selling strategy that looks good on paper actually in practice works. Sounds like in your case, it works beautifully, actually.
It doesn't always work. It's easier to sort of put, it's one of those assumptions you can put into a slide deck or the spreadsheet, and you can get some really free growth from it. I think you need to pick the customer well. I think you need to work out, it depends on how many decision makers you've got for the cross-selling opportunity to work, because they're the people who are going to advocate for your service or product. So I think it depends on the industry. But yeah, it definitely did work in our front. And it's also what led me to try and get my next acquisition. I sort of realized that's at this stage where I said, really what I'm buying is customers. I'm really buying access to customers, and they're the hardest thing to acquire. And so do you want me to talk to
and then Matt, you had said, like, when you said the thing about, what I was trying to do or what I realized I should do was build a Holdco, effectively, were you saying that is what you had? Because it sounded to me like you basically had a Holdco. A handful of brands, some integration on the back, cross-selling. So at that point, you got
unintentionally.
You did have a Holdco.
Correct, unintentionally, right? That's what I was trying to say before. Like I didn't go into this thinking that I'm going to go and buy a bunch of small education businesses and create a Holdco. But effectively, what happened after that, so that 2021 period, is sort of got to the point where I'm like, this is what I've actually got. I've got a Holdco, and that's like I started like watching the Chenmark guys and sort of saw what they were doing. I'm like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is what I'm doing. I'm just doing it at a smaller scale, but rather than finding people to run them, I'm just doing it myself.
Yeah. And on that point, are you still basically this lone, quick-moving entrepreneur guy, and all of the staff and managers within your companies are just working on within their little businesses? I mean, do you have any right-hand men or women or any management layer that are helping you with this vision and move this whole now much larger business forward?
At that stage, no. I just had people who, like, we effectively acquired, we call it mini operators, who were teachers who were teaching some type of service, whether it be science or music or performing arts, who I leveraged like a 10-hour-a-week admin sort of from, just as a deal with the people side of things. I didn't want to deal with the people. 100 casuals, all probably less than the age of 30, calling in sick whenever they'll call. I didn't want to have to deal with that. So I leveraged some, what I'll call leading teachers, to sort of take up some of that admin work. But apart from that, no, it was really just me driving all the things from the top.
And just on that point, you seem to have pretty effectively not avoided dealing with people problems. I mean, you said in your first business before COVID hit, actually, it wasn't effective. People were knocking on the door to your office all the time and asking you questions that they could just Google. And so you were just mired in people management. But it seems like later you did a good job of, creating distance between the people problems and just working on the strategic stuff you wanted to. Is that fair? And why were you able to do that so easily? Whereas that's something that so many listeners struggle with. Everyone wants to work on the fun strategic stuff, not the people problems, but it's very hard to actually do that.
I was still dealing with the people problems, I guess, as they come up. I think for me, it's just about your definition of what a problem is. I think, and where you've put your focus. So I think for me, like if I had a people problem, I was really quick to it. Like if they don't work, get rid of them, hire someone new, and really make it really clear to the people that were working with me at any stage that what success looks like for you is you not bothering me. And so, these businesses are small businesses that, we practically got rid of all fixed cost and it was all variable. And so I knew the work was always going to keep coming through. It allowed agility to be able to move through any problem, because if something did come up, I would just sort of, it's so insignificant. I wouldn't try and solve every single problem if any problem did come up. And so just put it back to people. There'd be times where if the problem got too big, where it was going to take too much of my time, I just like quantify and say, well, is it worth the $500 I'm going to be getting from it? No, move on. Let's just keep moving forward. So my time became quite valuable because I was managing, 4 or 5 different sort of strategies all in one. That was really, really important for me. I think adding layers of people, it was a strategy I knew that I needed to get to. But at that stage, when you're in sort of hyper growth and trying to scale as quickly as possible, I tried to avoid it at all costs. Also, given the fact that I'm quite blunt in the way I go about things, so I didn't want to have to make any more people cry along the way. So it was easier for us to sort of have, just send me an email or send me a Slack message and I'll get to it when it's important to me. And then, it's almost like if you call me twice in a row after I sort of rejected your calls, maybe it is important, I'll pick up the phone and answer it. And then even then, so it would still get probably put into a non-urgent, non-important bucket in my head.
Well, there's more to the story, but I want to just make sure we leave time for we're just running out of time here. So let's jump to the Elizabeth Richards story, which is a pretty wild one, and then we'll hear kind of where you are now.
Yeah. So sort of going back to my sort of story on trying to buy customers, I knew that there was an area in New South Wales, which is another state, it was our largest state in Australia, where I didn't have much penetration in from a customer sort of segment, as in like it wasn't where it should be based on the size. So I went to a conference and found that there was this business called Elizabeth Richards where all the teachers were hanging at this thing and they were selling like colorful boxes and tubs and effectively...
You're at an education supplies products conference.
Correct.
And they have a booth. Yep. And their booth is being swarmed.
Everyone's there. No one's coming to my booth and everyone's going to theirs. And I'm getting annoyed. So I'm going over and going, what the hell is this business? What does it do? And they were selling plastic tubs, educational resources, but, think like tables and chairs, but really colorful and really like, they had like a color spin on it. So anyway, I was a bit jealous of this business. I'm like, well, then I started doing some research and found that they were, New South Wales, they had a contract with the government for New South Wales and teachers loved them. They had like this one product where it was like the teacher diary that 75% of all teachers get this teacher diary and they buy it from them every single year. Like they've got some really good teacher goodwill. So anyway, I contacted the business owner for pretty much like 4 days after the conference. And he replied like straight back, said, sorry, I'm already dealing with another person to sell my business. And I was really upset because I knew that he was obviously selling. I'm like, I want to do this. I've known that there's a really large private equity player who's been rolling up these education resource companies. And so I just knew that was the person who would have been buying Elizabeth Richards. So I just went back to him like, is this private equity fund the one you're dealing with? And he's like, of course it is. And so I just sort of went back to him and said, you know what, like, I'll do better terms. They're probably going to be doing roll in. They're probably going to be getting you to stay back. Like whatever they're giving you, I'll give you 100% cash up front. At this stage, I hadn't figured out how I was going to do that, but I got into his ear and was able to sort of get him to sort of come over to me, and he got rid of those guys. And we were able to effectively to do that transaction.
And so he told you what they were offering, and you took him at his word and just said, okay, here it is in cash.
It was a really timely thing. I saw there's obviously more to it. Like I saw the P&L of this business, and it was, it was doing circa 7.5 million of revenue, 8 million revenue, about $1 million of EBIT. And so the margins I was making in my science business, which is a similar business of buying and selling products to schools, I was making nearly 30% EBIT margins at that point in time, and this guy was making like sub 15. And so for me, I was like, there's 15% that I can easily just strip out here somewhere.
Effectively doubling EBITDA, doubling earnings.
Getting close to, yeah. And so I sort of just have to take it. So I bought it. I bought the business. It was 5 times. So I bought it for $5 million.
And how did you come up with that sum?
Yeah, so talking about the debt before. So like there was because of COVID, the government was starting to offer COVID affected businesses these sort of short term or these like incentivized loan schemes where it was predominantly for working capital. But I'd spoken to my banker and we worked out that acquisition finance was a way that we could try and get access to this loan. And that was effectively government backed, which allowed it to have a sort of a capped interest rate. So I think I ended up getting that full $5 million, interest only for the first year and then over a 10-year period at a capped rate of like 5.5%, which at the time was quite good. And so I was able to leverage that and just use that full amount to then sort of fund the deal. And then I had to borrow a little bit of money against my other company just to fund some of the working capital. But yeah, we effectively was able to do a 100% debt buyout of that business.
Because there was this moment in time where this kind of COVID related scheme was going on.
Yeah. And like, I think when I found out about that scheme, like I was like, I want to go use every single dollar I can get access to. And so I think when he came back to me saying that it's $5 million, that's what it's for. I'm like, that fits the bill perfect. Let's just go for it.
Wow. That is good fortune that there was this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? Be like, because like we were actually in the second lockdown in 2020. There was like another lockdown that occurred at that point in time, and I was buying this business at a time when he was in another state, and I wasn't actually allowed to leave the state. So I bought the business without looking at it. Like I got there, like doing FaceTime, walking through the warehouse. I was trusting the staff to do an inventory stock take to make sure the inventory was what it was. We obviously had stuff in our sort of share buy agreement where I could call upon if there was any discrepancies, but. To buy a business for $5 million was the biggest amount of money I'd ever spent on a business up until that time without ever looking at it over a 30-day period. Like it was a rapid time because I said to this guy, don't go, because he was like quite well into it. I don't think he had any LOI or anything where there was exclusivity with these other people, but I said I could move really, really fast and I did.
Wow. Great. So that was what did you say? A $9-ish million business?
No, yeah, but 8 mil revenue.
8 million in revenue. And what was your existing Holdco in aggregate? What was revenue at that point?
At that time, probably around 5 or 6.
Okay. So so after this acquisition, you're now 13, 14 million.
Correct, in revenue. Yep.
Yeah. And EBITDA
would have been about 2.5, including the one, probably about 2.5 at that time.
2.5. Circle us back to the deal with your investors, the terms with your investors. So you've, I assume, done really well according to the performance metrics or hurdles in the structure with the investors. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So I think what happened was we obviously, search is always about having an exit. And, like you don't really think about how do you create a vehicle where there's like maybe a permanent Holdco or something where you no longer actually have to get that liquidity event to get that third tranche of investment, the sort of third. So I effectively went back to my investors and said, listen, if I was to sell this thing now, I'm already above 35% return. I'd already returned their initial capital back through dividends over the time. So they'd already had their initial capital back. And they knew that the business was where it was. And I think to incentivize me, they sort of said, we don't want you to stop. We want you to keep growing. We're just going to release that equity tranche. So I effectively became a full equity partner from just before the Elizabeth Richards. So that was probably after like the COVID period. I bought those 5 businesses through that process. Became a full equity partner with no more vesting required or anything along those lines, and then was able to start taking dividends myself.
So to be clear, the structure modeled after a traditional search fund was you would have gotten a carry. You would have gotten a percentage, 35% of beyond, if you hit certain hurdles of the proceeds of the entire project.
Correct.
Upon exit. But you didn't want to exit. So it was like, how does Matt get to take some chips off the table, get to have a liquidity event? while continuing to grow these businesses.
Correct.
So your investors released the agreement that you needed to actually exit the business and return capital to them for you to get your carry. Instead, they just said, you've earned your 35 or maybe now a little bit more percent. You now have 35% of the entire enterprise.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah, great.
So that was.
I wonder if that happens in search fund land among traditional searchers.
It should, right? Like, I think it really should, because it's incentivized someone to keep growing rather than trying to get out. Like if you can compound your returns, why wouldn't you? I think there's a misalignment there, I think, between investors and searchers, where that third tranche really only comes out in a liquidity event stage. I think if you can try and work with, align the incentives a little bit more to try and get growth, like I think any investor's happy for 35%, in 10 years time, if that can be compounded, why would you try and incentivize someone to sell too early just so they can take some chips off the table?
Yeah. Well, there are cases of this. This came up at a panel recently where the searcher often wants to sell for precisely what you're saying, because they may never have had a liquidity event in their life. So this is the first moment that they're going to come into real money. And so they're eager to do that. So the searcher wants to sell if they know that they will have hit their hurdles. Whereas the investors are saying, just keep, they want you to keep compounding. It's hard to find a good business with a good operator. You're a known entity. The business is a known entity. It's carrying along nicely. There's a whole long future, more growth that they can envision. If they sell and you return their capital to them, they're just going to have to turn around and figure out where to deploy it tomorrow. So they're incentivized for the searcher to stay in the business, but then the searcher never gets their liquidity event, or doesn't. It keeps being postponed and postponed and postponed. So this is an interesting way to do it. On the other hand, I will say, Matt, you didn't have a liquidity event. You got that equity that you now own, but you didn't get cold hard cash, correct?
Not at that stage. Yeah, not at that stage. I eventually did. I think as soon as that happened, I think I became more of an investor rather than an operator. So we're talking 3 years into the journey now, 3.5 years in the journey when that occurred. As soon as I knew that I was now in the money, we'll call it, my whole mindset changed of how I was now going to grow, because I was no longer now an operator working for someone else or working for investors. I was now a part shareholder of this strategy. And now I sort of said, okay, now where are we going to start allocating capital? So I started taking more risk, going down 100% debt into buying a deal, trying to figure out how I could try and exit and try and make some really quick wins along the way. And so I think that mindset shift is really, really important. I think that sort of drives you, and you should think like an investor from day one, but you don't. The honest answer is, as a searcher, you are working for your investors to try and get to a hurdle so that you can get something back for it. And so you have a board, or you have some type of sort of governance in place where you are still working for someone. Even though you might feel that you are doing this all alone, you're not. Financially, and the economics even state it, that you are working for someone else, because you got to return something back to them before you get anything yourself. So I think once you sort of release those shackles and you start to become more aligned, it does change the way that you think about things, and changes your duration, your duration mindset. Talks about how you actually start allocating capital, because now it's yours. Before it was like, I've got a free hit. Now it's like, well, no, now it's actually something and it means something to me. And so I think it's really, really important that you can get that with an investor. I only had 2, so it helps. I didn't have 10 or 15 panel. It allows you to sort of start thinking a bit more strategically.
And say more long-term, more patient, more higher risk tolerance or lower risk tolerance now that it's your capital?
You would make the assumption that you have lower risk tolerance. In my sense, it was probably the opposite. But yeah, I think your duration, so timeline sort of starts being pushed out a little bit more, because you don't have this burning platform to get this thing done in 5 years. But you can also start thinking about like Holdco strategies, and thinking about, what does my next sort of, like where I'm going to start putting my money. Do I want to be putting my money in my pocket? Do I really want to leave the money in the business to sort of start growing, more, buying more businesses along the way? Like, you start having that sort of approach of taking some money. My investors and I started sort of saying, okay, we'll have a 50% payout ratio from now on, and start thinking about how those type of payout ratios exist. Where as a searcher, you're not thinking about that. You don't really generally have those conversations. The investors are going to want their money.
You're breathlessly just trying to get to your single liquidity event.
Correct.
Are you going to tell the audience about the call you got the day after you closed on Elizabeth Richards?
Yeah. So we closed on the 1st of October. On the 2nd of October, I got a phone call from the private equity fund that I beat out on the Elizabeth Richards deal.
Whose deal you stole?
Yeah, correct. And like, it's like an ankle biter, right? Like, I think I'd been biting these guys' ankles anyway, in my other businesses for so long. So they knew who I was. And I think they were quite shell-shocked that I effectively got it from them. And that's sort of when they came to me and said, oh, we've been looking at you for a while. We love everything you've been creating. We'd like to buy everything off you. And it was like, I've just had this business for a day, and the other business is like, oh, no, we want to buy everything off you. I'm like, okay, that's great. But the offer they were offering me for the Elizabeth Richards side was quite small. Obviously, I don't own it for a day. They were trying to give me effectively $1 million finder's fee for that deal, and then but give me a fairly good whack on my other businesses, like 6x effectively on everything else, which is great given the fact that I bought the original for 3 and the others like 1 and 2 along the way. So I was getting a really good arbitrage opportunity on those. But I knew that I was going to really get a good whack on the Elizabeth Richards. I knew that I could really drive some growth value in that. So sort of that disappeared effectively. So we put that on hold.
So you said no, you declined them.
Yeah, went through that process, correct.
Because you thought the Elizabeth Richards a deal was undervalued, even though it basically you would have made $1 million in a day.
Correct.
And even though when you talk about the existing Holdco, that's fantastic multiple expansion from 2s and 3s up to 6.
That's correct. Yeah.
And even though this Matt was your perfect buyer, there's not going to be a more strategic buyer. They are a Holdco of education services, so they're in your industry. You're on their radar. They know you. They want one of your businesses badly. They almost bought it themselves, until you snatched it. So I'm just, tell me more about the decision. Not to do it.
It was just, I think there was just a lot more value to be created from that first business. So from Elizabeth Richards, like I knew that they were going to be, and I think they were also, I'd mapped out where they were in their strategy. So this business had just been sold from another private equity to private equity swapping businesses, as they always sort of do. And they were like 1 year into their journey. And so like, I think the way private equity works is that they were really acquisitive in the first year. And then, they were sort of, might second year, they might do what they need to do. And then they sort of bunker down for the sort of years 3 to 5. And then towards the end, they might try and top up some more. So I sort of thought that they were going to come back eventually. I hope they were. So for me, it was like, well, why don't I just sort of do what I know I can do in that Elizabeth Richards business, and then we'll see what happens. And that's eventually what happened. So we've effectively stripped out about $800,000 of cost out of that Elizabeth Richards in 1 year. Merged warehouses with the merged warehouses we had. Cut the fat again, as I sort of had done previously. We sort of same playbook. Revenue had not grown. It was effectively flat. It was just in the time of when all the freight costs it went up massively. Like I had like huge freight cost chart, increasing. Everything importing from China was like from $5,000 a container to $50,000 a container. So it actually hurt. My gross profit pretty much stayed flat. We had revenue growth, but gross profit maintained. So all of my growth in the bottom line came from cost out program. 1 year in, I'd only been paying interest only on my debt, this full sort of like $5.5 million of debt that I put through. And then I knew that I had this like burning platform of where I'm going to have to start paying down my debt in year 2. And so started sort of, flirting with the idea of, maybe I could get these guys to give me a call again. And just started liking some LinkedIn posts of the business development guy that I sort of had been sort of meeting, and just trying to get back on, just so I don't forget about me. And funny enough, he gave me a call. It's like, oh, how you been? How's Elizabeth Richards going? I'm like, oh, it's great. He's like, how are the other businesses? I'm like, great. He's like, because we might be in the mood to talk again. I'm like, oh, I probably, and at this stage, I think I'd worked out that obviously created some good value with Elizabeth Richards. And my other businesses were even, I entered like the health education space in my Southern Biological business. So we were doing really, really well. And again, thinking like an investor now, I was like, okay, well, I'm not selling everything, but I'll sell you Elizabeth Richards. I know you really wanted to get that one. And they're like, oh, what about everything else? I'm like, no, I'll sell Elizabeth Richards to you though. And so effectively we were able to sell Elizabeth Richards and make about a $4 million profit in that 12-month period while keeping my other businesses. And that's effectively where we sort of ended up.
Congratulations, Matt. So you were absolutely, you played it perfectly.
Yeah, I think I was just, again, you talk about, hardship or being scared or, getting back to the wall. It's a hard decision to say no, but it was a harder decision, I think, it was a strategic decision. I wouldn't say maybe it's hard, but it was a good pathway.
Good for you. So you could have sold it for $1 million more than you paid for it. Instead, you held on to Elizabeth Richards, took out 800, improved earnings by 800,000.
Yep.
And then over 12 months and sold it for $3 million over what they'd originally offered you. Do I have that right?
Correct. Yeah. So it was about $3.8 million in total. That were once we sort of all the working capital true-ups and everything occurred. But yeah, it was effectively a $3.8 million profit.
Good for you.
And I got rid of all my debt, which was really cool as well.
Did you have your liquidity event then?
Well, then I did, right, for myself personally. I was able to take, my money off the table. We were able to do some rejigging on the equity side as well for within my investors. So I effectively got up to 40% equity now in my what's now my sort of baseline companies. They're doing about 2 million of EBIT now under management. Like I've stuck them under management. I've got a manager finally in place. I think once you can know the business inside out, it's really easy to get someone in place to come and manage those types of things. And yeah, I'm now effectively sort of an investor, effectively I call it, with my sort of passive income coming in from my original businesses and my liquidity event giving me my sort of chunk of money that I have something to do with. And it's good times now.
Yeah, Matt, congratulations. You are really sitting atop the mountain here. And how old are you?
I'm 40, turning 40 this year.
Okay. Good for you. That's really exciting. So to close us out, what you are working on something, again, with sort of the investor mindset now. What is that?
Yeah, so I think, after this, me and one of my main investors, who's now my business partner, we sort of flirted with the idea of like, let's just go and do a Holdco ourselves. Let's just keep buying more of these businesses and, just do what we've done over and over again. I think we just keep finding the issue with people. You can't really go and find, a really high A type sort of player who A grade player to go and run a pest control business, for example. So the hunt for talent was really, really important for us. So that's where we sort of went to some people and said, hey, you know what, this is what we've done. Maybe we can institutionalize it. And so we set to raise effectively an ETA style incubator where we've raised $30 million of private equity funding to then go invest in people first private equity, call it. So Enduring Investment Partners is what we've just set up. And we're looking at finding 4 CEOs for the Australian market under a similar type of search model where we've got the back office, we've got the database, we've got the interns, we've got all that back office set up, and we're effectively finding people who would have thought about search, but maybe search is a bit too hard for them, on the traditional front, but going with a private equity fund that's focusing on that type of sort of same search mindset gives them a bit of safety. And gives the experience of what we've had going through this process. So that's the first of its kind in the Australian market. It's similar to some of the other incubators that exist in the US and the European markets. And we're really
Matt, why did you choose the model of kind of positioning it as a place for searchers or mid-career people to go search, as opposed to just being a traditional private equity fund and having operating partners? Because in your model, you'll share much more carry with your searchers, if that's what you're calling them.
Yep.
I don't know what it is, but let's say it's traditional search fund economics, 25%. Whereas in a traditional private equity fund, if you guys just source the deals, did the deals yourselves, and put in operating partners, you could do that for a lot less than 25% carry.
There's definitely the reason why the model exists is because there is an unquantifiable at the start, but definitely I think at the end, a quantifiable alpha that you get by finding someone who is young, mid-career, hungry, potentially working at a Bain or a McKinsey or something along those lines, who wants to go and run a small business. I think that hunger and that sort of that horsepower that they can offer in a small business is always going to outdo a 55-year-old grey hair old head. I think Graham Weaver from Alpine Partners does it really, really good, where he talks about sort of the experience versus time, and where that if you find someone with not much experience but have got time to grow, there's this triangle of sort of opportunity that you can really sort of create extra alpha on. So we want people who can really try and traject and grow, and we feel like you're only going to get that in a not to be ageist, but a sub 40-year-old exec who hasn't probably hit the peak yet, but wants to have some impact in a small business. The Australian market requires follow-on capital. Inorganic play is a really, really important factor as well. And so for us, I think someone who can actually go in and have the grit and resilience to do 80, 100-hour weeks like I did, to try and grow and scale both organically and inorganically is really, really important. someone who's been sitting at a GM level or someone who's been sitting as a COO or something of a larger enterprise, who are the operating partner types, they're used to having people around them, used to sitting in meetings, used to having the infrastructure. It's really, really hard to sort of get that person to come down into a 1 to 3 million EBIT space and actually drive through it, because it's dirty, right? You've got your back to the wall. You need to get through the mud, and you want the mud on your face to get through it. I don't think, unless there might be exceptions, there might be people out there who are that operating partner sort of mold. But for us, a 35-year-old ex-consultant, ex-banker who's got a bit of hunger and grit and, that drive, and that smell of money, like that's really, really important, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I've never heard it articulated that way. You're making a lot of sense. Great, Matt. And so Enduring, what was the name of the project or the firm?
Enduring Investments. Yeah.
Great. Well, Matt, you and Simon Plummer, also in Australia, who I had on a few months ago, who also has kind of a long-term vehicle, and Pete Seligman, who was one of my early guests. I don't know how active Pete still is in the Australian market.
Yeah, he's fairly active.
He's pretty active. It's pretty interesting how the searchers that I've interviewed in Australia, who've then been, I think I might be forgetting 1 or 2 others, but maybe not, actually, then graduate to becoming sort of the elder statesman of ETA in Australia, which I guess goes to show that it's a very small market. And by being somebody who's one of the few searchers who's had some success, you can then kind of graduate to be somebody who kind of pays it forward to the next generation and is involved in their deals and kind of becomes a bit of a thought leader.
I guess so. I think the market's so nascent, right? So I think no one's really doing this at scale in the Australian market, and that's just because the SBA in the American market, that is what's driving value. That's what's driving deals to be happening. The Australian market just doesn't have that liquidity. So I think it's a really good spot to be playing in, because if you can buy things at 3s and 4s, even if they're long-term whole businesses, the returns are unbelievable. So while there's no one playing in the pond, I might as well try and lap it up myself as much as possible, because as soon as it gets started, I'd hate to be having to work in a really hyper-competitive market like it is in the States. So I'm sure if people could go back 30 years, before people ETA was in the stateside, they would tell you the same sort of stories of how easy it is and how lucky they were to be at that time. We're just 10, 15 years behind, the States. So we're in that lucky time now. So I want to try and leverage it as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And so is Enduring active now? Are you actively soliciting your partners?
So we've got 2 CEOs that are starting in the next month or so, and still recruiting 2 more at the moment. So again, still the type, we've got an ex HIG private equity and Bain guy. We've got an ex BCG guy who's starting with us. So we're really trying to target that really high end talent. And with the backing of the fund, it sort of makes that risk people take in a traditional search, takes it away a little bit, because they know they're coming to a bit more establishment. They've got people who know what they're doing and have worked in this type of space before. Hopefully 1 + 1 = 5.
Great, Matt. Anything else you want to share that we didn't get to?
No, I think we covered most. I probably spoke too much anyway, so thanks.
No, it's great. Fascinating story, Matt. I feel out of breath listening to you're a fast talker, but a fast mover. I mean, you've packed a lot into your years since you got into this back in 2018, 19. So pretty, aside from what you're doing now, you built the passive Holdco. This is the dream for a lot of searchers.
Definitely.
So, great. Congratulations, Matt, and thanks for sharing with us.
Thanks, Will. All the best, mate.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. Don't forget to subscribe to the Acquiring Minds newsletter. We send an email for every episode with an introduction to the interview, a link to the video version on YouTube, and soon, key takeaways, numbers, and more essentials from the interview for those of you who don't have time to listen or watch it. Subscribe at acquiringminds.co. You'll also find all our webinars there on the website, both those we have coming up and recordings of past webinars. At this point, there are over 30 webinar recordings, a wealth of information on all the technical nitty-gritty of buying a business. acquiringminds.co.